Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me? Is the first question. Fantastic. I'm going to take that one yes I saw and run with it. Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mary Davis Fournier, and I'm Deputy Director of the American Library Association's Public Programs Office. And I'm also project directing the exciting new initiative that this webinar relates to, Building Common Ground, Discussions of Community, Civility, and Compassion. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for this online learning session. It focuses on planning and presenting library-organized common ground tours of communities. This session is presented by programminglibrarian.org, a resource website of the American Library Association Public Programs Office, developed with support from the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the ALA Cultural Communities Fund. Today's session is open to anyone interested in creating a tour of this sort for your community and has been provided with the hopes that each of you will consider applying for the Building Common Ground Small Grant Opportunity for Public Libraries. Information about this funding opportunity is currently available at ala.org/common ground. The ALA landing page will take you to the project page. In a nutshell, 30 libraries will each be awarded a $2,500 programming grant. Libraries are required to submit their program plans for a multi-format series in line with the guidelines available on the project website, and they are required to recruit at least one community partner for the initiative. The application deadline is November 18th, 2011. The goal of this project is to engage the public in contemplation and discussion of the importance of community, civility, and compassion in their daily lives. It's our hope that after identifying issues of concern to your community, you will utilize the program, project resources, and your own ideas to create program opportunities for meaningful reflection, engagement, and action between community members. This session will dig a bit deeper into one of the Building Common Ground project's most exciting resources. Whether your community issue or area of concern that you and your peers have identified deals with conservation issues or interfaith communication or urban violence, by the end of this session you will have a far clearer understanding of how to use this program model and the Creating a Common Ground Community Tour Guide to tie those issues to significant sites in your community, and those tours will be excellent pathways for discussion in themselves. We first came across the tours concept through a guide our presenter, Deirdre Colgan, had created in association with a PBS initiative called God in America. Her Sacred Spaces Tours and Guide to Creating Sacred Spaces Tours offered participants access to a variety of places of worship and spirituality, and the ability to view those sites through nuanced lenses of architectural, cultural, and faith traditions. When putting together this initiative, we saw the opportunity to take this wonderful program model and reframe it just a bit as Common Ground Tours. These tours are intended to take community members on a library-curated tour of significant sites that will engage participants in their community's collective memory, places of natural or man-made meaning, beauty, or reverence. We are extremely grateful to the Fetzer Institute for their support of the Building Common Ground initiative. We're also delighted to have all of you with us today and hope that you will think about using this program model as a component to a Building Common Ground grant proposal. Before we get started, I'd like to set out some basic information about communication in this online classroom environment. Then we'll move along to the main presentation. Please do not use the instant message feature to post technical questions. If you are experiencing technical difficulties, you should send a private message to our tech expert, Angela Hanshaw. You click the arrow on the top right of the chat box and select Start Chat With, and then select Angela Hanshaw. She's also listed as host either under attendees or as host. We'll also have a question and answer period after the main presentation. In order to keep the program on track, we ask that you type any questions you may have during the presentation into the question and answer box on the right. At the end of the presentation, our speaker will answer all of the questions asked, and it hopefully will be easier for you to pose them as they occur to you in that box, and then we'll come back to them later. But there'll also be a time at the end to post any new questions you have in the chat box or in that forum. And finally, if you experience technical difficulties during this session, don't panic. The complete presentation is being recorded and will be available for download after the program's conclusion. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Deirdre Colgan. In addition to being the author of the Guide to Creating a Common Ground Community Tour, Deirdre is a practicing artist whose eclectic consulting practice is known under the moniker Hybrid Design. From August 2008 to October 2010, she served as the executive director of the Chicago-based architecture nonprofit Sacred Space International. During that time, she, along with a team of architects and designers, created a series of 8 city guides to sacred spaces to accompany the PBS series God in America. She regularly presents architectural and other specialist material to a variety of public audiences, from lectures and tours to panel discussions. She holds a Master's of Architecture from the University of Illinois at Chicago and a Master's in Fine Art Sculpture from the California College of the Arts. Her bachelor's degree is from the National College of Art and Design in Ireland, and she currently serves on the board of Chicago Women in Architecture Foundation. Her current practice is concerned with the sequestering spiritual space among the tumult of everyday life. Deirdre has already created a wonderful guide for this program model for us, and I hope you will have a chance to you've had a chance to review it already. We are so lucky to have her here with us today to drill down a bit into the program model and to share some of her best practices to creating these very special community tours with us. So I'd love you all to give her a virtual round of applause as I turn the microphone over to Deirdre Colgan. Thank you.
I hope. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello. I'm just going to turn up my mic a little bit. Sorry about that. Turned out that I was talking into the ether. Sorry about that, everybody. Can you hear me okay now? I'm just going to Okay. Hello, everybody. I'd love to welcome you here today. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually in order to talk more about how to create a common ground tour within your community. So, hello, sorry about that. Sorry about that delay. It turns out I was talking to myself there for a while, so I apologize in advance for the slight delay. So thank you so much to Mary for your wonderful introduction. I appreciate how you explained this amazing program element that I feel I want to welcome you to create your own common ground community tour for your library participants. Um, I'm going to start off by talking about this word common and just that's me. Hello. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about how I'm thinking of this word common in relation to this kind of programming. And when you dive deeper into the meaning of common, not only does it mean belonging equally to an entire community, nation, or culture, but it also means something very ordinary, like common knowledge, something very familiar. And the reason I'm drawing your attention to this is that these sites are oftentimes so close to us and so everyday that we manage to overlook them. I also want to just remind you that as a librarian, you yourself are perfectly qualified to lead and design this tour. However, there's a couple of different ways you can go about it. And what I've chosen to do in the webinar presentation today is to really show you some visual examples in order to illustrate what I feel are good sites to think about as you create this tour. So I'm going to show you some examples. This is a list of sites that I've rounded up that I feel are perfectly appropriate for your tour. The first kind of site is civic in nature. So it can consist of engineering projects, such as this amazing example, the Brooklyn Bridge in New York City. They've recently created a special park because so many people flocked to see this marvel that went up at the end of the 18th century, believe it or not. And now we have a place that you can go and look at it in more detail and stand underneath this bridge. This to me is a great example of a common ground site. There's a site here in Chicago locally called the Chicago Cultural Center, but believe it or not, it was the main public library in Chicago. It's a place where everybody in Chicago can go and listen to music, to see artwork, but it's also consisting of the most amazing, masterful glass domes, the largest Tiffany dome in the world, and also some amazing tile work. And you can see the traces of the old function of the space here, Chicago Public Library. This is another civic example here, a much smaller scale, the Charlevoix Lighthouse in Michigan. And I feel like it's just as valid an example as these larger city kinds. So whether you're in a very rural environment, in a small town, or in a city, you'll find that you'll find these kind of sites all around you. So the next kind of site I'd like to talk about are landscape sites. Here's an example close to me here in Chicago, the Alfred Caldwell Lily Pool. Alfred Caldwell was a landscape architect who worked very closely with Frank Lloyd Wright, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It's really a haven in the middle of the city. It's hard to believe it's in the middle of Chicago, but you can enter this site and feel complete calm, really just get close to nature here. To me, it's a great example of common ground site. Here's another more formal example, the Bethesda Terrace and Fountain in Central Park, also right in the middle of the city, very formally laid out, classical architectural landscape site, designed by Olmsted and Vaux. But at the middle of the fountain is a sculpture by one of the first women to receive a public commission for this kind of work, Emma Stebbins. Here's another kind of landscape site here in Chicago. There was a quarry right in the heart of the city in the Bridgeport neighborhood of Chicago called Stearns Quarry. And recently, within the last 3 years, it's been converted into a public park. And it's now part of the Chicago Park District, Palmisano Park, it's called. But you can stand on a hill, which, if you've ever been to Chicago, you know is rare, and take this great view of the city skyline. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. I think I'm missing a slide. Oh, I'm missing a slide here, but the next kind of site I'd like to talk about are traditional religious sites. This is a very historic church in the heart of New Orleans called the Immaculate Conception Jesuit Church. It's a Catholic church, and you can see the baptismal font. From the exterior, it looks like it's part of any city building, but once you open up inside, the light pours in through these clerestory windows, and you find yourself in a very formal Moorish space. Here's another example of a very traditional religious space, the Islamic Cultural Center, which is a mosque in New York City. It's on the Upper East Side. And oftentimes I find that people are very intimidated by sites like this. If you're not of the denomination or if you're not yourself religious, and this is a secular kind of tour that we're discussing here, it's sometimes hard to think that you can access these kind of religious sites. But to me, they're perfect examples of common ground sites. Oftentimes you'll find that the people that practice in these sites, that practice their particular religion, are very open and welcoming and very eager to share what they believe. And so you'll find that's a good entree to get inside these sites and explore with your tour participants. Here's the interior of a famous synagogue in New York City, Temple Emmanuel, which from all appearances looks like one of the grandest cathedrals in Europe, I always feel, and that was the look they were after. But if you get closer, you'll see these menorah and the Nir Tamid in front of the ark, all very representative of the Jewish tradition that this space is celebrating. This is another kind of religious site, the Voodoo Spiritual Temple in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I met the spiritual leader of this space, Princess Miriam, her name is, and I found myself very in a completely alien space, but I wanted to find out more, and I asked for permission and received an invitation to go inside and meet this woman and see this space. Here's another very different kind of space. It's sometimes referred more to as a piece of artwork than as a church. It's within a larger church space called St. Peter's Lutheran Church in New York, but it's a very tiny chapel. It's almost like being inside a Joseph Cornell box, if you're familiar with that box artist. It was designed by the sculptor Louise Nevelson. Here's another example of a non-denominational religious space. It's the chapel at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, designed by Eero Saarinen, who's more famous for his TWA terminal at JFK Airport than I think a lot of other things. The sculpture you see in the middle connecting the skylight to the altar space is by the furniture designer Harry Bertoia, who often collaborated with Saarinen on projects. And it just shimmers and glimmers there in the light. So the next kind of site I'd like to talk about are memorial sites. In the background of this title, you can see the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Site in Washington, D.C., designed by Maya Lin, and she was very young. So to me, that's the kind of site I'm introducing to you as an example of this kind. The Lafayette Cemetery #1 in New Orleans is a classic example of a memorial site, one of a very early kind of graveyard, where people really built houses for the dead, for their families, and went to visit them, believing that there was much less distance between living and dead at that time. This is another kind of memorial site in the heart. It's often called the heart of Santa Fe. It's right in the middle of the plaza in Santa Fe. And if you look at this obelisk right in the center, I'm not sure if you can see it, but it reads "To the Heroes." But if you look closely, it looks like those words have been re-inscribed, and I believe it said "To the Conquerors" at one time. So this memorial has numbers of layers of history going on. And then if you look a little closer, it says "Who have fallen in the various battles with Indians," and there's a blank where there should be a word, and that word used to read "savage." So this is a very controversial monument that a lot of people wanted to be removed, but Santa Fe chose to leave it there so that conversations could be held about the meaning behind these words and to talk about that kind of controversy within the city's history. Here's another kind of cemetery site. In particular, this is the memorial site for Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of the Church of Christ Scientists. She was born and raised in Boston and lived there all her life and founded what she called the Mother Church there. Mount Auburn Cemetery contains many more people than just Mary Baker Eddy, but I thought it was a good example of a site that was so beautiful that people used to go there to picnic and to take their leisure, and eventually after enough people started wanting this kind of space in their own city, it was the forerunner to parks that we know now, such as Central Park. And in Chicago, the Park District parks we have. There was no such thing as a park district before this cemetery was founded. So the next kind of site I'd like to talk about is probably the most difficult to explain, and the one I'm calling sacred ground. And we're not all lucky enough to have Taos Pueblo in our backyard, but this is probably the easiest example to understand of sacred ground that's been continuously used by its inhabitants in the same way for over 1,000 years. And in the background of this Taos Pueblo, you can see Taos Mountain there, the sacred mountain of the area. But there are sites within our own cities that still remain, even though they've been covered over or buried oftentimes within the development over time of our cities and towns. For example, I was in Atlanta, Georgia, and I kept seeing this word Peachtree wherever I went. There were many, many streets called Peachtree and names of shopping malls and monuments called Peachtree. And I asked some locals who live there, what is Peachtree? And I discovered that it was the place that the Creek and the Cherokee Indians used to come to re-tar with pitch their canoes and bring their horses and their animals to salt licks along the riverbed. So myself and a collaborator went looking for this famous creek, Peachtree Creek, and we found it only very far away from the center of the city in the form of this little creek you can see in the slide here. But its traces remain imprinted within the city grid because all the freeways and streets that used to follow it are still curved. Here's another sacred site where in my home country of Ireland, Croagh Patrick. It's a pilgrimage mountain, and still every year on the 17th of March, which is St. Patrick's Day, people walk barefoot up Croagh Patrick. So it's similar in a way to my country as Taos Mountain is to the Taos Pueblo Indians in New Mexico. Here's another kind of site, a very formal traditional site that used to be a huge city, and now all that remains are these grass-covered mounds at Cahokia, Illinois. And this was the center of the universe at one point in the US before Western settlement, before the Europeans came to what's now the United States. But the traces of this civilization remain here. And I'm thinking if you look carefully within your own backyard, you too will find these traces of sacred ground. For example, this is the view out my window in Pilsen in Chicago. It's a neighborhood here. And you see this diagonal street amongst what is usually an extremely rigorous grid in Chicago. So to me, this was the original pathway from the river to the lake, and it still remains embedded in the city, even throughout this gridded geometry. So the next kind of site I'd like to bring to your attention are those where public art is cited. In the background, you can see Louise Bourgeois' eyes. Here's an example in Minneapolis by Klaus Oldenburg and Cozy van Bruggen. Klaus Oldenburg and Cozy van Bruggen made a living out of enlarging everyday objects and blowing them up in scale until they were almost unrecognizable. So I just thought that was a good way to frame this kind of site. This is an example of a public artwork outside the, I believe it's outside the Walker Art Center, yeah, museum. There's another one here in Chicago, often called the Bean because it looks like a giant jelly bean, but it's by the English of Indian descent sculptor Anish Kapoor, officially called Cloudgate. Here's another example of a site of art. This is a reproduction of a painting by Grandma Moses, a folk artist, and the bank whose parking lot this overlooks have recreated this painting in the form of a giant mural. This is another example of mural art, but in this case, the whole building has been turned into a mural. It's in the Mission District of San Francisco, and it celebrates the Mexican tradition and the mural art tradition that really founded itself within this neighborhood. And this is the Women's Building, a site of activism historically and feminist center and shelter and educational building. And this piece of artwork has been in the news lately, if you recognize it. It's the piece of public art that's in what's now the site of Occupy Wall Street in Zuccotti Park, New York. But this is a piece by Marc de Souvreau, Joie de Vivre, the joy of living. And it's been pictured lately with people climbing up it and getting arrested. And so all of a sudden, it's become this site of tension and just forms such a rich basis for conversation in my mind. So the next kind of site is also a little difficult to explain. I thought it would be helpful to provide you with some examples of sites that could be eligible, in my opinion, within this category for your tour. So here's a very traditional craft site in Glendalough in County Wicklow in Ireland. Even though it's hundreds of years old, this site was built in about between 400 and 600 AD and reconstructed a couple of times over those years, but still that perfect arch remains intact, even with all the damp weather and the rain in Ireland. But there's also sites that might be closer by you. There's always controversy about graffiti, but I feel like this is just such a beautiful example. It's almost tribal in its nature. And this is the kind of graffiti that can improve neighborhoods rather than take away from them. So once again, if people have a strong opinion about graffiti, I think it might be interesting just simply to talk about that on your tour and explore what that means for different people. Here's another example of a crafted site in a very rural setting, but it's a symbol and a product of labor and of work. And so this harvested hayfield, I feel, is a great example. Right in the middle of Boston, Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, from the exterior, contains this wonderful brickwork. And if you look closely, you'll see it forms the letter Y. And that was because Isabella liked going by the Spanish spelling of her name, which began with Isabella, Y. And so she imprinted her name on the outside of the building. And then on the inside, she traveled extensively throughout Europe on her grand tour and brought back the products of her shopping trips in the form of these murals and mosaics and from Rome. And she was able to bring them back section by section, and she reconstructed them in this site. And so here's a site that's completely out of its original context, but now we can go inside and really enjoy this space. There's also a statue of the goddess Diana. So I thought it would be helpful for you if I were to go through the questions that I think you might want to think about both yourself, but also present to your tour participants so that either before you go on the tour or while you're in the various sites, you can think about these. And then before you think about them, think about what's going to happen after you've visited all these sites. Mary mentioned at the beginning that each of you might be choosing an issue to focus your tour upon. So, for example, if that focus is conservation and you're looking at sites that are in danger of demolition, or you're thinking about neighborhood violence and you're looking at graffiti. You use these issues and these topics to really curate the sites that you're including on the tour. Don't feel like you have to include a survey of every single appropriate site. That's the trick here. I think in this case, it's definitely true to say that less is more. And so these are just some things to think about as you go on your tour. And I'll go through some visual examples. So the context of the site that you're looking at, I think, is really, really important. How does it appear from the exterior? Is it easy to find? Is it different from the other buildings around it? Is it close by, or is it far away? Is it intimidating? Is it welcoming? All of these things are described in the guide in more detail, but here's some other examples of things to consider. Structure. How is it made? How is it built? How does it stand up? And here's an interesting example I thought to illustrate this. In Chicago, there's a church in a loft space in the traditional historic Printers Row area of Chicago. And by coincidence, it just happened that these heavy timber beams are held together by what's called, in architectural terms, a fish plate. And it forms a cross. And so they just left it like that after they removed part of the flooring, and it functions as the cross within the church. Orientation is really important, and oftentimes if you think carefully about the order of events on your tour, you'll be able to time it so that you go there at an opportune time when the site looks better one way than another. For example, in the morning or in the afternoon, depending on the direction and the orientation, a space could look completely different. And we just happened to be here when these light reflections were being cast through the stained glass windows on the other side of this temple space in Atlanta. So the appearance of the exterior. In downtown Chicago, there's a store called Avenue, as you can see here on the left, and it looks very humble, kind of, very ordinary looking exterior facade. But when you go inside, there's a mosque inside, and it's opened up to the sky. It's light filled. It's beautiful. So, there can be a lot behind a facade like this. The Downtown Islamic Center actually rents that site out to the store Avenue. So the materiality of your site, what is it made from? What does it feel like? How is it made with great craft or not to last? Is it an ephemeral site? Is it natural? Is it man-made? And here's Central Lutheran Church by the wonderful Italian architect Pietro Belluschi. And it's got this craftsmanship that's so well put together. If you look carefully, you'll notice that there's different levels of crosses inscribed in that brickwork. Here's a site in New York City, a relatively new site, and I have to admit it's become my new favorite place in New York. It's the High Line. It's like a vertical park, and it used to be an old train viaduct, and now it's this wonderful piece of landscaping. It's successful, I think, in every way. You can find places of quiet to read or relax, and you can also find more busy, crowd, people watching sites, and it's all along an abandoned train line. And I think they're talking about doing that here in Chicago. I'm not sure about your city. So light is an element that you might want to think about as well, and just to consider when you're in the site or before you go. Here's another example by Belushki, actually, in Portland, another church. He was known for his jewel box-like churches that he designed. And if you look at this very humble on the right, I think, appearance of glass block and brick, but what happens when you're inside is that it gets this dot matrix appearance on the left there, like you can see, just becomes magical. And the symbols that you'll see in a traditional site obviously will be one thing, but also around your city. Here's an example of a terracotta sculpture, bas relief or a low relief in Art Deco style of the Rod of Hermes, which is usually how we identify with medicinal or medical pharmaceutical symbols. So this tells us something about what the original purpose of that site was. And you can ask yourself, is it still that? Is it something else now? So for pattern and layout, here's an example on the left of stained glass forming a pattern with color and light. And on the right, You can see in that same mosque we looked at earlier on in New York, the Islamic Cultural Center, they have repeated this grid of the square over and over again at such an intense level of scale that on the left you can see the furniture is made from this, but if you look at the overall plan, you'll find that same gridded square within a square is how the building has been made. And the last thing to consider in my mind, a good thing to bring to the attention of your tour participants is how is this site in some way, if it is, connecting sky with ground? This idea of axis mundi, or center of the earth. And in historical terms, on the left, you can see an example from Ireland called an ogham stone, it's pronounced. These sites are scattered throughout Ireland and they look like obelisks. They look very almost phallic in their appearance, but believe it or not, there's a well, there's an opening in the ground beside every single one of these in Ireland. And it's just, I think on the right you can see MIT Chapel is like the embodiment of the negative way of combining sky to ground. And so oftentimes in a park or in a shaded wood, you'll find the sensation of being both on the ground and also being connected to the heavens. And it's the definition behind many of the spiritual spaces we find around us, I think, still, whether it's religious or not. And so I would love to answer questions that you have to see if you understood the guide, and just also once again remind you that when you are designing your own tour, use thoughtful consideration when selecting your sites, and let this issue that you chose help you to focus your tour. And I'd like to come back to the idea of after the tour is complete, what do you do? How do you talk about these sites? How do you bring attention to the issue that you've chosen to focus on? How do you encourage both conversation and debate? And I think the key is to plan in advance, whether it's by yourself or with your expert, and plant these seeds of discussion both before the tour, during the tour, and then after the tour. Create an opening for dialogue and conversations to happen in your library to talk about what you've seen. And ideas that you could have for programs that do this are, you could think about holding an exhibition of photographs that various people took while they were on your tour. You could encourage people to tell the stories of their memories of the site, or why they were interested in these sites, or what they thought about them if they'd never been to them before. It's also an opportunity for oral history gathering and collecting local knowledge that, if it isn't collected, will be lost. I think the library is a wonderful place to receive this knowledge and archive it for the good of the community. It's also possible to create a printed memory book or a publication about what you experienced on the tour. So all of these are ideas for post-tour engagement and programs. And with that, I'll hand you back over to Mary, and I'll say goodbye for now, and then I'll meet you in the Q&A window, which you can see over on your right-hand side. So Mary, I'll hand the mic over to you.
Let's try again. Can anyone hear me? Yay! What would this be without an audio glitch? It would not be a webinar. So thank you so much, Deirdre. I'm sure everyone has been dreaming up their own community tours while Deirdre was taking us through all these possibilities. And I see that we've had a number of questions pop up already. I wanted to say just a few things before we open it up for Q&A and just tackle the questions that are accumulating. I wanted to touch on the upcoming grant deadline again. It's November 18th. That is the deadline to submit an online proposal for the Building Common Ground Discussions of Community, Civility, and Compassion initiative. The application guidelines, the online application, and a wealth of supporting resources can all be found at ppo.ala.org/common ground. Angie, if you can hear me and you can move us over to that sort of end space that shows the link to the website, that'd be great. There it is. Thank you for attending. Okay, we're not done yet though. Also, in just 2 weeks, we'll be hosting another webinar. I'm just going to plug it quick because I'm sure some of you will have to sign off promptly. That's also related to this initiative called Programming with the Charter for Compassion, including creating reading groups focused on the 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life by Karen Armstrong. That webinar will dig into facilitating reading groups and creating programs centered on the Charter for Compassion. It will take place on Thursday, November 3rd at 1 p.m. Eastern, noon Central, and 10 a.m. Pacific time. And you can register the same way you registered for this one through the project website. And archive versions of both presentations will be, and the copy of the PowerPoint will be available as well. Also, tomorrow you're going to receive an email with a link to access this content directly and also invite you to take a brief survey about today's session. We'd be so grateful if you would just take a few minutes to share your feedback with us. So it looks like we have just about our planned 15-minute time for remaining questions, and I'm going to, I think many of them are, as I'm looking at this, most of them are really questions Deirdre can probably best answer. So I'm going to turn the mic back over to her for this. And then Deirdre, if you encounter any that you think are specific to the initiative that you really want to me to do, then I'm happy to take the mic back. Okay, thanks.
Hello. Hello, this is Deirdre again. Gosh, sorry about that. Just a tiny little technical thing there, I think. So I'm just looking at some of the questions here on the right, and I see one from Catherine Ames. Does the tour have to be completed within a specific period of time? You know, that's a great question, Catherine. The answer is yes and no, because it's totally up to you. It really does depend on the kinds of sites that you choose to go and visit. So there's an area in the guide actually right at the beginning when you're involved in the process of designing the tour and planning at the upfront area, so pre-tour, you'll see that there's a whole write up just about duration and schedule. So you need to understand that it's going to take you time to get from one site to another. It's really going to vary upon if this is a walking tour or a driving tour that you're designing here. And there's descriptions of why and how you would do that within the guide. I would say, you know, a good amount of sites is between 3 and 6. And it's totally up to you if, what you want to take on. But like I explained, this is a curated tour. So it's something that you've really thought hard about and used your issue in order to focus the sites that you've selected. And then that will determine your specific period of time. So I hope that explains that. So I'm seeing here a question from Sue about her issue. Her issue is inequity in our city. A tour would be very different than you described. Any advice? Gosh, I think this tour would be perfect to describe inequity in your city, and it would really be a wonderful um, focusing program to talk about this exact issue. And it would, an idea that just comes to mind is, what is a site within some of the most expensive real estate within your city, and what is a site contained within some of the lower real estate within your city, and just include both of those. And maybe this is a tour that is a driving tour. And there's a couple of ways that you can design that are outlined in the guide. So if you'd like to give me a bit more information, I could maybe, you can let me know if that helped, or if you'd like to follow up with that. I'm just trying to find another question here. Helps. What do you think about virtual tours? That's a great question, Sue. And I think my personal opinion is that there's nothing better in this kind of tour than physically experiencing the site. And there's a whole section about this in the guide called Being in the Space. There's something that we can't explain that happens when you go in person to one of these sites, and just allow yourself to experience it and help your tour participants to do that themselves. And to me, there's no replication online.
Hi all, this is Mary, and some of the questions have to do with specifics about the grant opportunity, so I'm going to answer a few of those. Holler in, you can't hear. Can anyone hear? I'm thinking Karen was talking about something else. Oh good, everyone can hear. Okay. So I'm going to try to go through these quickly. So let's see. Claire, great question. Do we have to focus on a specific issue? What if our focus is simply finding common ground? So the notion, if you are going to do include a common ground tour as part of your program series for this grant opportunity, is that for the overarching series you identify an issue or a concern in your community and program around that, in some way to create venues for discussion and reflection and action around those issues. So if finding common ground is the way you want to characterize the concern in your community, an absence of common ground, it's sort of, I don't see why that can't happen, but it's up to you in the narrative, in the proposal narrative, to really explain to reviewers of these applications, and these reviewers are your peers, so largely other public librarians as well as members of our office and from the Fetzer Institute, to explain what you mean by that, to really flesh that out, what the manifestations of this lack of common ground are, how that's carrying out in your community, what your hope is or your goal is for finding some common ground, what you hope will come out of that. So I hope that answered that. Is a tour mandatory? No, it's not. Absolutely not a requirement as a part of this. It's one of the more fascinating program resources that we assembled for this, and we thought it really merited a webinar, because we hadn't really put this out there as a possibility in the past. So you don't have to do it, but we're hoping that some folks do. It would be very interesting to us, and we'd love to see how it works as part of an overarching program series. And let me see, I'm looking for other questions. Is the tour guide on the Building Common Ground website? Yes, it is. You can link to it. Angie just put the post in the chat. You can also link to it. There's a link to it in the registration pod for this webinar that you went to, and it's in the resource section of the website as well. So it's all over the place, and it's terrific. Deirdre did a wonderful job. Let's see. I'm looking for other open questions. Angie, our tech person, it seemed like there were a bunch, but maybe they've all been resolved. So can you post in chat if there are any more unresolved ones that I'm just ineptly not seeing as part of this Adobe Connect form? That's all of them, she says. Okay. I want to invite you all to chat, put any more that you might have in chat. I do hope that you will all apply. I would love to turn the mic back over to Deirdre for one other thing that I just think is sort of lingering out there. I'm not sure if you've all had a chance to read the guide. I think some of you have not yet, but I was hoping that you would be able to just, oh, there's one more. She says there's one more. I'm going to get to it. Okay, Catherine has a question. So does the program grant need to be completed within a period of time? The programming window for this grant, and this is all in the guidelines, the grants themselves will be awarded at the end of December. The programming window for this grant is, I believe, February 2012 through November 2012. So it's about a 9-month window. And the program series needs to take place somewhere within that window of time. Questions? Okay, we have a couple more minutes, and I was going to oh, good. I'm glad you think it's fascinating, Catherine. I will hope to see your application. Okay, so what I was going to ask Deirdre to do is talk just a little bit about sort of just any remaining tips she has in terms of best practices for either arriving at a decision to lead this tour yourself, to find a facilitator, to work with a scholar, to any tips of those sort and that she may have, knowing full well that she's really gone through most of these in the guide. She's really spelled it out, but I'd love for some of you to hear her thoughts on that while she's here. Okay, I'm going to turn the mic back over.
Hello. Yes, thanks a million, Mary. I think that's a good point. Yeah, like I said at the beginning, you are so well qualified to do this, and I think it may seem, I mean, a lot of the examples were from faraway places and maybe far away from where you are, but if you simply open your eyes, you'll find yourself surrounded by appropriate sites. And just don't take things for granted. The person who was concentrating on the issue of um, equality, I think it was. I think that's a wonderful focus for a tour like this. And so I think, sometimes the sites may seem humble, but it's oftentimes sites like this that produce the most conversation and dialogue. Why did you feel it was appropriate to include? Can you have a conversation about that? Can you involve your library users in the selection process? Can you use surveys or crowdsourcing techniques to encourage and solicit applications to be part of this site inclusion? So there's lots of ideas like that. So in regards to involving or working with an expert, you could think about choosing someone like an architect to help you, or an art historian, or a local history expert, or simply a member of the community who's lived there a very long time and is completely embedded within your community. These are all perfectly suitable to include as an expert. Um, while you're working with that expert, you can just consult with them in your research and planning phase, and then move on yourself and do the coordination and the leading part yourself. Or you can choose to engage that expert as the leader of your tour. Or another option is you both do it together. So, there's a couple of different ways to look at that process of working with an expert. So I'm just reading the chat box here, which I think is a really interesting comment by Carol Ahmed. We can gear different programs within our series towards different angles, some secular, some religious. This question about the overall program, not just the tour. I let Mary respond after but I'll just respond in relation to the tour. I think a wonderful way to organize this tour is to include both secular and religious spaces. And you yourself can decide what is the appropriate proportion. Do you just include one religious site, one that people want to know about, that have questions about? Or do you include two to compare and contrast? Or do you do half and half, secular and religious? Or do you just include secular sites? Is that a more fruitful tour for the focus that you've chosen as your issue? So I'll hand it back over to Mary, because I think you might be able to shed more light upon that issue in regard to the other programs that are options for the grant.
Hi all. Okay. Great question, Carol. There is no mandate that you absolutely have to pick one issue. I think that you would be best served in terms of putting together a competitive application for this initiative by making a case for what you want to do and what you want to tackle within your community. We really do instruct our peer reviewers to put themselves in your shoes and bear in mind that you know your community best. My only caution would be that you not try to spread things too thinly over what is really, at the most an 8-part series, an 8-program series in terms of what you want to delve into and accomplish with the series. But I'm going to be really looking forward to seeing what you come up with. And I think the best thing is just to focus your goals for the program and think about the best way to serve those goals with your and articulate that in your proposal. So I hope that helps. I think it's exciting that you want to come at it from two different angles, though. If there are no more questions, we are really at time here. So I cannot thank Deirdre Colgan enough and the Fetzer Institute for sponsoring this project and being brave enough to take it on and encourage us to bring it to you. And now to all of you, thank you for joining us, and I do hope I'll see your names on some of these proposals by November 18th. And if I don't, I hope that you will take this notion and find a way to implement it in your library programming regardless of this initiative. I think and we would love to hear from you. If you have any questions at all that didn't get covered today, feel free to go to the project website, contact our office. All of the emails are on the project website, and follow up with us. If you have specific questions about your application that you felt were too complex for this, feel free to contact me through the project website, and I'd be happy to schedule a time to chat with you about it. And thank you all again so much.